thing is, though, is if he came from the Calvinistic tradition, which he did, that kind of understanding, the problem is that he doesn't hear the cheap grace overtones in his whole theology, his whole system. Because as we know, they teach that you can be a Christian and a sinner at the same time. Matter of fact, when people pointed to him and said, I see a contradiction there. What he would do is he'd say, well, that you're talking about Luther and you're Martin Luther, which we do follow. We believe in Luther's emphasis that we need to be saved by grace through faith. Problem is that when it came to sanctification, he believed you stay a sinner and you're a Christian at the same time. Okay? And that just didn't mesh. Well, so what he did is he said, no. He would answer you if you were to attack Dietrich Bonhoeffer on that point. He'd say, no. There's a big difference between somebody saying that you inevitably have to sin every day in thought, word, and deed, which is what you're implying Martin Luther taught, and the fact that after they've done everything they can do to avoid it, they still have to someday end up doing it. I don't see a difference, okay? Ultimately, that's his difference, but that was what he thinks, and it's not true. Most people who deal more honestly with history with Martin Luther would admit what Wesley said about him. And this is what Wesley said. Wesley said that he doesn't think the Reformation, which is Martin Luther's revival, went far enough. He said he got it right on justification, but he said, I've never known anybody more confused on sanctification, okay? And so this was something that he had to see through, this man, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, so he missed the point to some degree. Well, then there's Karl Menninger, and this one is an American psychiatrist. Notice that I didn't say a theologian. I didn't say a Bible scholar. I said a psychiatrist. This fella is sitting there. Now, friends, in their line of work, they don't believe in sin. Generally speaking, it's a medical condition, right? Generally speaking, it's a mental condition. Something is, you're depressed or something like that. But this fella, in his line of work, started noticing that the pulpits were becoming more and more silent about the issue of sin. So he wrote a book called Whatever Became of Sin. I have to diagnose your condition. You're not depressed because you have a condition and it's just God's fault and it's just this fallen world. You're depressed in a lot of cases because you have sin in your life. That's a depressing way to live. And he just realized this, and so he started pushing it. And that was, now notice the dates. We stressed from Dietrich Bonhoeffer that his book came over to English in America in 1948. That was that warning, the first warning signal. A lot of people missed it. Then Karl Menninger's warning came in 1973. You'll notice that's a key year in some of what we're talking about. He says, how often does a sermon deal with sin in general or in particular? Now, listen what else he wrote. He said, since 1953, now his book was written in 1973, so 20 years straight, he says, no president of America, even back then, any longer mentions sin as a national failing. Do you realize how long ago our president stopped talking about that? He says that's not happening. He says, yet few clergymen, so even preachers in his day, back then, he's saying, venture to call for repentance, as did the prophets and John the Baptist. Very few of them do that. And Jonathan Edwards and Professor Mower, he says they fear the public reproach. Nobody wants to be unpopular, even back then, as a preacher. He says they don't want to be lined up with those people called the hell, fire, and brimstone type. He says they dread this accusation so much that they don't speak out even when they believe what they believe should be heard and heeded by the man in the pew. So he's saying, I have Christian, some preachers are Christian and they really they know what they should be telling the people in the pew, but they're not going to do it because they fear being lined up with a bad rep. Okay? He says the clergyman cannot minimize sin and maintain his proper role in our culture. Failure to do so, and a lady as well, it's not just men preachers, but he says, failure to do so, reproach his or her listeners is his sin. If you don't preach the whole gospel, you're sinning in the pulpit, and you can do that, all right? But what was his hindrance to seeing the full picture? Well, again, he wasn't a theologian. He was a psychiatrist. In later years, he was a member of the First Presbyterian Church, another denomination that doesn't believe in sanctification the way holiness people do. And so, again, that would be a hindrance, a difficulty to work through when it comes to the concept of sin. But I want you to know that those two issues, cheapening grace and losing how serious sin are, go hand in hand. Okay? They go hand in hand, and we're going to see that. Now, the next person, some people would say, that doesn't belong on there. Well, I don't care. I know she belongs on there, at least in our denomination. My mother, Reverend Pettit, in about 1990s, and you'll notice the dates are important on this, she started preaching sermons that reflected an idea that kind of got summarized in a sermon, which I have a little bit more on after this, called Hebrews chapter 10. And the idea in summary, in a nutshell, in that sermon, which I've seen change many, many people's lives, was don't take God's grace and cheapen it into a license to sin. Okay? And she used that emphasis, and she had a lot of sermons in the 90s that were leading up to that. And she used it, and she would preach it quite often. So I see her, as a prophet, somebody God also raised up with these others, and started speaking to us, warning us, don't take my grace for granted. Okay, it's very important, but don't twist it into a license to sin. And so her sermon, now look, this is kind of a neat way of looking at that sermon. Go to the next slide. You can't see those. This is an outline of both her sermon and a 100-year-old sermon from Bud Robinson. She never read that sermon. She hasn't read that sermon to this day. But she was preaching, line for line, what he preached to the Church of Nazarene 100 years ago. I mean, we have the scriptures, the same scriptural passages. These are all the comparisons, the same subjects. It even goes on to the next slide. But they're just the same point, crossing God's deadline, taking God's grace so much so for granted that you end up pushing God too far. And they both warned us 100 years apart, exact same outline, never read the sermon. I'm sitting there in the Olivet Library going, what? Okay? That was God's warning. All right, now the next fella. God used him as well. Richard Taylor. He's one of our best theologians, died in 2006. But look at the date, okay? Right after the early 90s, when God was warning our church with my mom, 1998, he wrote an article which was seen as prophetic. He knew he was going to get a bad rep for that article. He knew it as a theologian. Well-educated man, he knew he was going to get in trouble. He said, why the holiness movement died. It's kind of like coming to a parade where everybody else is thinking everything's going great and telling them, oh, it's really not all that great. And that's what he told them in that article. And he points out that he thinks it's because, notice, a key book on a key word that we're talking about today got published in our book. There's that same year, Whatever Became a Sin, 1973, 1972. I've seen different versions, 1974. But A Theology of Love by Mildred Wynkoop. Notice the word.